Well, hello. It's lovely to have all of you with us today. Let me welcome you on behalf of the Kentucky Historical Society to First Friday. My name is Carol Easterly, and I am a museum program coordinator here in Frankfort at the History Center. And I'm very pleased to be welcoming Dr. Ann Marshall as our speaker today. I'll introduce her in just a moment. But before we get started, just a few reminders about our virtual space here. Do please remember throughout the presentation to keep your microphones on mute. We're going to have a little bit larger group today, so that's going to be especially important. I do encourage everyone to keep your web camera on if you do have one. We like to see your smiling faces, but do remember that everybody can see you. I recommend switching to speaker view so that you'll be able to see Dr. Marshall's presentation clearly, and you can click on that little icon up toward the top right corner of your screen. I'm sure that you are going to have lots of questions for her. And so we want you to use the chat feature to submit those. And that is the little conversation bubble icon down toward the bottom of your screen where you can type those in. Lastly, of course, we want this to be a space of listening and learning and respectful dialogue. So do please ensure that any questions or comments you submit are civil and appropriate. Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ann Marshall to you. She's a Kentucky native, graduate of Centre College. From there, she went on to the University of Georgia, where she received her MA and her Ph.D. in history. She's researched and published extensively on the history of the Southern United States, particularly on the subject of Civil War memory. Her 2010 book, Creating a Confederate Kentucky, The Lost Cause and Civil War Memory in a Border State, was one of the very first books that I was assigned to read as a graduate student. So I honestly was a little bit starstruck when she agreed to do this presentation several months ago. I'm especially grateful to have her with us today because the subject of Confederate memory has become even more timely over the last few months. And so like all of you, I'm anxious to learn more about it. So without further ado, Dr. Ann Marshall.
Thank you so much for having me. When Carol asked me to come and talk, this was pre-pandemic months ago, and I'm just really glad that even with the conditions as they are today, that I'm able to come and speak to everyone. So my presentation is just under 30 minutes, which I hope means that we'll have a lot of time for Q&A afterwards. Just a couple of things. One of my slides has a wrong date on it. I say the right date, but the wrong date's on the slide. You'll see what I mean when we get to it. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that I recorded a portion of the presentation during a thunderstorm. So there's a possibility that there might be a little extra bass toward the end of the presentation. What I would like to do is to basically talk about how and why Kentuckians, after the Civil War, from a Union state, white Kentuckians decided to celebrate the Confederacy, even though they were in a Unionist state. And so I'm going to talk about some of the manifestations of that Civil War experience, and how they remembered it. And I want to talk about how some of the manifestations of this lost cause narrative, and I'll talk about what that narrative is, remains with us today and how we are grappling with it. So I'm going to try to share, hopefully the audio works. If not, we'll have to deal with some technical issues, but here goes.
So this is a subject that I wrote about almost a decade ago in my book called Creating a Confederate Kentucky. Before I pursued this topic as an intellectual exercise, I was interested in it because of my own personal experience. As a native Kentuckian who grew up in Lexington in the 1980s, I still heard and saw a lot of evidence of this Confederate-dominated narrative around me. Every Sunday on my way to church, My family drove past the Confederate statues on the lawn of the Fayette County Courthouse, one to John Hunt Morgan and one to John C. Breckinridge. When I visited the Lexington Cemetery, I saw these two statues in the Confederate lot. When I took an elementary school field trip to the Perryville battlefield, I could see that there were two monuments dedicated to Kentucky's Confederate dead and only one to the state's Union.
Let's see. Dr. Marshall, you have gotten muted somehow. Okay. Can we back it up just a little bit? Would that be possible?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, let's see if the audio, if you can hear the audio now.
So, this is a subject that I wrote about almost a decade ago in my book called Creating a Confederate Kentucky. Before I pursued this topic as an intellectual exercise, I was interested in it because of my own personal experience. As a native Kentuckian who grew up in Lexington in the 1980s, I still heard and saw a lot of evidence of this Confederate-dominated narrative around me. Every Sunday on my way to church, my family drove past the Confederate statues on the lawn of the Fayette County Courthouse, one to John Hunt Morgan and one to John C. Breckinridge. When I visited the Lexington Cemetery, I saw these two statues in the Confederate lot. When I took an elementary school field trip to the Perryville battlefield, I could see that there were two monuments dedicated to Kentucky's Confederate dead and only one to the state's Union men. This was confusing to me because I had, after all, taken fourth grade Kentucky history, where I'd learned that Kentucky had remained in the Union and that more Kentucky men had enlisted in the Union Army than in the Confederacy. So, why didn't the memorial landscape of Kentucky match its official role in the war? Well, I still had these questions years later when I went off to graduate school and I needed to write a dissertation. And so I decided to figure out why it was, as historian E. Merton Coulter put it almost 100 years ago, that Kentuckians, quote, waited until after the war was over to secede from the Union. After all, the nearly 100,000 Kentuckians who fought for the Union greatly outnumbered the at most 40,000 who fought for the Confederacy. So why is it, people have wondered, that the way Kentuckians would remember the war would not have been just as divisive as the manner in which they fought it? Why is it that the celebration and remembrance of the war swung so directly towards the Confederacy? And why in the decades following the conflict did white Kentuckians elect 5 governors who had sympathized with or fought for the Confederacy? Why did they cheer in the streets in 1877 when the last federal troops left the South, removing the final vestiges of federal Reconstruction? Why did they build monuments, publish Lost Cause magazines, participate in veterans organizations and historical societies, and write literature that portrayed Kentucky as Confederate, while seemingly leaving the Union cause and the feats of its soldiers largely uncelebrated? Well, before I tell you why white Kentuckians embrace this thing we call the Lost Cause narrative, I want to briefly explain what it is. The Lost Cause as a term originated in a book of the same name written in 1866 by Edward Pollard, a Richmond newspaper editor. Pollard laid out the causes of the war, which he stressed were about tariffs and states' rights and not about slavery, and gave an account of the noble struggle waged by both brave Confederate military leaders and patriotic citizens on the home front. But Pollard also emphasized that Southerners had lost more than the war. Indeed, he explained, they had lost an entire way of life that had been happily distinctive from that which Americans lived in the rest of the country. A civilization replete with faithful slaves, who were, according to Pollard, very well treated, gracious and submissive women, and beneficent and chivalrous patriarchs. Within the lost cause, there was also a call to action for the future, a determination to resist any measure of African American equality, and a defiant commitment to retain Southerners' own laws and policies in the face of what they saw as federal interference. Well, these ideas about the nature of the Civil War and Southern antebellum life quickly transcended Pollard's book, and they grew into a larger, broader movement in the South to glorify the war as well as the men who fought it. For the next 50 years, the Confederate dead became powerful cultural symbols within the New South, infused with an assortment of conservative, racial, gender, and class values. The lost cause worked in the former Confederacy not only as a vindication for the past, but as a blueprint for shaping a future that would, as much as possible, maintain the pre-Civil War racial, gender, and class status quo. But back to Kentucky. On the face of things, while it seemed that embracing the lost cause, white Kentuckians were claiming a defeat that they hadn't actually suffered, and a cause they had not actually lost, that's not really how they saw it. Kentucky, of course, had been a slave state, and white Kentuckians, despite their devotion to the Union, had never entered the war in order to free slaves. Most of them were angered when the federal war aims expanded to include emancipation and African American enlistment in the Union Army. Given the anger and betrayal that white Kentuckians felt over emancipation and their own loss of property rights, it's not surprising that these themes would reappear in post-war politics and the culture of Civil War remembrance. It became clear throughout my research that the conservative racial, social, political, and gender values inherent in Confederate symbols and the lost cause greatly appealed to many Kentuckians. In a post-war world where the racial boundaries were in flux, the lost cause and the conservative politics that went with it was not only a way of making sense of the past, but also a way to reinforce contemporary efforts to maintain white supremacy. So let's look at some of the manifestations of this lost cause memory in Kentucky. I'll start with monuments. Monuments are important to historians because they're one of the most visible and permanent ways that we can see how people commemorated the Civil War. If you think about it, parades, Memorial Day celebrations, and other commemorative activities do not have the same permanence. You'd have to go back and look in local newspapers for accounts of them. But monuments, because they are made out of stone, bronze, and marble, and because they are in many places placed on prime civic real estate in front of courthouses or in town squares, have much more visibility. Because of this, at least until recently, they assumed a sort of psychological and physical permanence in many communities. Not surprisingly, monuments to the Civil War dead and living played a big role in Kentucky's latter-day embrace of the Confederacy. This map shows the 61 Civil War monuments in Kentucky that have been designated by the National Register of Historic Places. But depending on how you define what a Civil War monument is, there are really more. When I was researching my book, I broadened the definition a bit and found that in the 70 years following the war, Confederate partisans erected over 70 Confederate monuments within the state, while Unionists erected fewer than 10 during the same time period. In my research into the causes and consequences of Kentucky's belated embrace of the lost cause, such a lopsided showing in favor of the Confederacy was one of the most obvious pieces of evidence of the very constructed nature of the state's peculiar Civil War narrative. But the form and placement of these monuments changed over time. Early monuments erected in the 1870s and 1880s tended to be simple obelisks and usually placed in cemeteries. But in the late 1880s and 1890s, a new style of monument appeared, the parade rest infantryman. This figure was, as art historian Kirk Savage has put it, compact, cheap, and easy to reproduce. Soon, monument companies like Muldoon Monument Company, based in Louisville, Kentucky, began to sell these standardized designs to towns across the South, and they enabled communities who would not have otherwise been able to afford a monument to buy one. My favorite example of the relationship between mass production and affordability comes from Jessamine County. After 16 years of low-yield fundraising, the veterans organization there scraped together the nearly $1,500 necessary to purchase a monument commissioned by another town, which decided not to go through with its order. The problem was, however, that it was a statue of a Union soldier. But the Muldoon Monument Company had the federal figure altered in order to appear Confederate by changing the belt buckle to say CSA instead of USA, and sold it to the Jessamine County Veterans Group for a reduced price. You can notice that the hat on the soldier is a kepi-style cap, which is more typical of Union monuments instead of the broad-brimmed slouch hat favored for stock Confederate soldiers. The places monuments appeared also changed after 1890. Once sequestered in cemeteries, they now began to appear on courthouse lawns and in town squares, making their lost cause message even more visible. They also went up with great speed. Between 1895 and 1914, the number of Confederate monuments in Kentucky exploded. Between these years, Kentuckians erected 27 new Confederate monuments, but only 3 Union monuments. It was Kentucky women who were in large part responsible for the huge proliferation of Confederate monuments across the state. Through their local female-headed monument associations, many of which folded into the United Daughters of the Confederacy after its founding in 1894, these women typically commissioned the statues and sponsored public fundraising campaigns to pay for them. One thing that bears mentioning is that in many communities, these Confederate monuments were only possible through the financial support of the community at large, not only former Confederates. But monuments were far from the only way Kentuckians commemorated the lost cause. Kentucky also became home to 2 magazines which celebrated the belated Confederate war effort, the Southern Bivouac, which was published in the 1880s, and The Lost Cause, which appeared in the 1890s and was published through the early 1900s. These magazines highlighted the experiences of all Confederates, but paid special attention to Kentucky Confederates and boasted thousands of subscribers throughout the South and the rest of the nation. They further helped to cement the image of Kentucky as Confederate in the minds of their readers. Popular literature was another way that Kentucky's Confederate identity spread. One of the greatest influences was author Annie Fellows Johnston and her Little Colonel series. The first book was written in 1895 and garnered a huge readership. And by 1912, Johnston had added 11 books to the series. These books were later adapted into a very popular film starring Shirley Temple. The plot of the Little Colonel books revolved around a Kentucky gentleman, Colonel Lloyd, who has disinherited his daughter Elizabeth for marrying a Yankee. Everyone is miserable until his 5-year-old granddaughter, Lloyd, enters his life and makes friends with her grandfather and reunites everyone, and they all live happily ever after in a big Kentucky mansion. Another influential writer was Irvin S. Cobb. Cobb was a journalist and writer for the Saturday Evening Post, and he authored a series of over 25 widely read short stories set in his western Kentucky hometown of Paducah. Cobb's stories centered on a Confederate veteran named Judge Priest, who was later played by Will Rogers in a film adaptation. Though Annie Fellows Johnston and Irvin Cobb, along with other widely read Kentucky authors, set their Kentucky-based stories after the Civil War, they specifically rooted them in a nostalgia for an antebellum slave-based past whose vestiges lived on in the benign African-American and Confederate sympathizing white characters. By writing about the Commonwealth as a place where Old South values prevailed after the war, and as home to people intimately connected to the Confederate experience, Johnston and Cobb, both of whom developed a national reputation, helped further the perception of Kentucky as a Confederate state. The Lost Cause movement in Kentucky, as in other southern states, had a strong educational bent to it, largely thanks to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. In Kentucky, the UDC sponsored essay contests on topics like the meaning of secession and states' rights, and produced supplements to textbooks used in public schools in the state to make sure the students got what they thought of as an impartial history of the war, an interpretation of the war which claimed that secession had been about states' rights and not about slavery. Really, this work, which was done all across the South, was much more influential than monuments, as it shaped the way that generations of Southerners understood the war. In Kentucky, however, the UDC's effort to control the Civil War narrative went even farther than in other places when, in the early 20th century, they attempted to ban the traveling production of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was in the years before movies, and Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of the most popular plays in the country, often coming to towns once or twice a year. Beginning in the early 1900s, the UDC launched a campaign against Uncle Tom's Cabin on the basis that it gave a negative impression of slavery and slaveholders. They claimed that the play was, quote, injurious to the community because both the production and the novel on which it was based presented a picture of slavery in the South that they said was, quote, essentially false. False because it presents what is rare and exceptional as normal and typical. Instead, they argued that relations between master and slave were usually, quote, kindly and mutually beneficial. They started with a petition, but eventually, after a few years, the UDC took more direct action and started to pass legislation that would ban the play in Kentucky. In January 1906, the UDC galvanized the support of chapters across the state and began to pressure the State General Assembly to action. Members from all corners of the state pledged their support for banishing Uncle Tom's Cabin from the stages of their state. Together, they appealed to their local politicians to use, as Florence Ward of Grayson, Kentucky put it, quote, their vote and influence on our behalf and the blotting out forever from Kentucky of the disgraceful Uncle Tom's Cabin. Moreover, the women realized that by criminalizing the staging of Stowe's play by reason of the social danger it presented in the present, they could also prevent the showing of any similar productions in the future. Their effort proved successful. In March 1906, the state legislature passed a statute known as the Uncle Tom's Cabin Law, which stated, quote, it shall be unlawful for any person to present or participate in the presentation of, or to permit to be presented in any opera house, theater, hall, or other building under his control, any play that is based upon antagonism alleged to formally exist between master and slave, or that excites race prejudice. Breaking this law was punishable by fines and imprisonment. With this bill, Kentucky Confederate women succeeded in editing not only the history of Kentucky's role in the war, but the portrayal of the conditions leading up to it. But it's important to stress that despite the overwhelming Confederate influence in the state, Kentuckians certainly did not share a uniform memory of the Civil War. There were several alternative war narratives that worked to counter Confederate memory in Kentucky. Notably, an African American narrative which focused on a Unionist victory as the source of emancipation, and also a Unionist memory that was focused around eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian region. A significant number of African Americans and white Republicans imbued their politics and their commemoration of the Civil War with a different vision of Kentucky's wartime experience, one that recalled the state's loyalty to the Union. For these whites, the end of slavery had been a long time in coming and held open the possibility that Kentucky might finally become a fertile ground for industry and white labor. And Black Kentuckians regularly called on their service and sacrifice for the Union in their efforts to seize their freedom, negotiate new labor arrangements with whites, and extend their claims of citizenship to the courtroom and the ballot box. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they used occasions such as Emancipation Days and 4th of July celebrations to call for expanded rights. In this picture that's on the screen now, you can see an Emancipation Day parade that took place in Jenkins, Kentucky, which is in far eastern Kentucky, in 1924. This is pretty interesting because presumably, given the fact that Jenkins is a coal mining town, these would have been African American miners, many of them. A group of African American veterans also built a monument, this one in Frankfort's Green Hill Cemetery, to honor Union soldiers of the United States Colored Troops from Central Kentucky. They this modest 14-foot tall obelisk on July 4th, 1924, which on one side bears the seal for the Grand Army of the Republic, the primary Union veterans organization, and on the other three sides listed the names of 142 Black soldiers. At the time they constructed it, this monument stood as only one of a handful of monuments in the nation to honor Black Union troops. But Civil War memory also varied regionally within the state. In the late 1800s, a very different historical memory developed for Eastern Kentucky, one that was based on the idea that the people of Appalachia composed a distinctive civilization. In 1890, Lexington-born author James Lane Allen penned an article in Harper's Magazine in which he claimed that there were, quote, two Kentuckys. It can never be too clearly understood, he explained, for those who are wont to speak of the Kentuckians, that this state has within its borders two entirely distinct elements of population. By those, he meant those that inhabited the Bluegrass Plateau in the central and western parts of the state, and those who populated what he called that great mountain wall which lies along the southeastern edge of the state. They formed, according to Allen, two discrete human elements, the Kentucky Highlander and the Kentucky Lowlander, and they were, as he said, quote, long distinct in blood, physique, history, and ideas of life. Within this context of Appalachian exceptionalism emerged the idea that Kentucky had endured two divergent Civil War experiences. One featured the landed slave-owning bluegrass aristocrat who had sided with the South out of custom, kinship, and a pro-slavery position. The other, the Kentucky mountaineer, had, according to contemporary literature, little or no contact with slavery and had, by virtue of his century-long isolation and undiluted devotion to democratic institutions, had sided with the Union. The Highlander-Lowlander dichotomy in Civil War loyalties was central to the narrative of Appalachia found in popular magazines and in the literature of authors like James Lane Allen and John Fox Jr. But both the African-American emancipationist narrative and the idea of a Unionist Appalachia were really overshadowed in the end by this lost cause version of history, because Appalachian Kentucky was almost always cast in opposition to the rest of the state and was considered to be the non-normative area of the Commonwealth. The supposed blanket unionism of Appalachian Kentucky ultimately served to reinforce the state's general Confederate identity. But this Confederate identity and memory has started to change in recent years as Kentuckians have chosen to remember their state's Civil War experience in more varied and nuanced ways. A prime example of the broadening of historical memory in Kentucky began a little over 15 years ago with the state's efforts to reclaim Abraham Lincoln on the eve of his 200th birthday. On one level, it's not surprising that in the 21st century, state officials and citizens alike might be swept up in the national excitement surrounding the occasion. But such positive public outpouring did mark a sea change in regard for the 16th president, who only claimed the vote of fewer than 2% of Kentuckians in 1860, and who was reviled by many white Kentuckians for over a century after his death. Memory of Lincoln was, of course, never non-existent in his home state. Both his Hodgenville birthplace and later his wife's home in Lexington became national historic sites. But generally, however, Lincoln was underappreciated within the Commonwealth. This began to change about 15 years ago or so, however, when the state of Kentucky began plans for celebrating the 200th anniversary of his birth. Like official historical organizations around the nation, various entities around the Bluegrass State developed plans for a 2-year-long tribute to the now revered president. Under the auspices of the Kentucky Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, historical societies, public libraries, tourist sites, and other civic groups developed dozens of programs, events, and exhibits to mark Kentucky's connection to Lincoln. The state also developed the Kentucky Lincoln Heritage Trail, which included nearly around the state, linked some more closely than others to Lincoln's life and to his Civil War legacy. In both its style and substance, the events and the places highlighted in the Commonwealth stressed Lincoln's humble roots, his unlikely rise to the highest office in the land, and his lasting legacy in keeping the Union intact during the Civil War. The bicentennial effort also highlighted his role in emancipating enslaved African Americans, the very act which had made him so unpopular in his home state almost a century and a half before. In the post-civil rights era, it seemed that Kentuckians were ready to embrace Lincoln for the same reasons they had once maligned him. Well, the memorial landscape has also changed a lot since I published my book, as everyday Kentucky citizens have become more and more aware of the meaning and power invested in Civil War memory. In 2001, the city of Louisville and the University of Louisville commemorated Freedom Park, a memorial installation surrounding the city's Confederate monument on the edge of campus. The finished park included 10 obelisks inscribed with information about the city's history from settlement to current day. The text on each highlighted the role that Native Americans and African Americans, both enslaved and free, played in the city's growth and development. The park also featured 9 glass panels, each of which depicted the achievement of 20th century civil rights leaders in Louisville. The park was an effort to historically contextualize the Confederate monument, leaving it in place but letting the exhibit surrounding it tell a different history, that of people who had been left out of the historical narrative in the late 19th century. It was meant to not only reorient a historical narrative, but to rebalance the power equation. But these contextualization efforts proved symbolically insufficient. In 2015, widely circulated photos of Dylan Roof, who massacred 9 African American churchgoers at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, showed him posing next to Confederate flags. These images reinforced all over again the connection between Confederate history and present-day white supremacy and racial injustice. Public pressure in Louisville against the monument increased, and ultimately the mayor and the university president decided to relocate the monument to a new home in Brandenburg, Kentucky in 2016. The next year, the connection between Confederate monuments and white supremacy was underscored at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. In the wake of that event, Lexington Mayor Jim Gray, along with the city government, decided to remove the Confederate statues of John C. Breckinridge and John Hunt Morgan from their long-held perches in front of the former Fayette County Courthouse. More recently, recognition and protest of police brutality against African Americans has led to the removal of the Jefferson Davis statue in the state Capitol building, something African American civic leaders have been advocating for a couple of decades. As people have realized that the lost cause narrative in Kentucky was never really just about the past, it seems that more Kentuckians will continue to question its future presence in the public narratives of their communities.
Okay. I'm back.
Appreciate you. I know that some of that stuff is more recent than your book, so I appreciate that you incorporated that into the presentation, certainly. So we've had a few questions submitted in the chat. You might have been looking at that as well, but I can go ahead and share a few of those if you'd like, and then we can see if there's some more. Trish Ramey wanted to find out, she said, did I hear that the first reference to lost cause and all that appeared in 1866? Just wanted to be sure of the date.
Yes, that's correct. 1866, because that's the date of publication of Edward Pollard's book. So just the year after the end of the war.
Another guest, it doesn't have a name here, but the question is, how many slave owners existed in Kentucky at this time? And I'm assuming they mean at the time of the Civil War. Do you have any idea?
Yeah. Okay, so I don't have like an actual number, but I have a percentage. There were about 20% of Kentuckians were slave owners, the households as counted by the 1860 census. And so that's actually, 1 in 5 households owned slaves. Many, many more Kentuckians, white Kentuckians, were sort of attached to the system of slavery, however, because the phenomenon of essentially leasing slaves was very common. So you would basically lease the labor of a slave for a year on a yearly basis and house that slave and clothe that slave. And we don't, unfortunately, have great numbers about, we know that historians have shown that slave leasing was very common, so there are many more white Kentuckians who shared in that experience of slave ownership than the 20% actually sort of typifies. The typical slave number of slaves that a household would own, though, is smaller than, say, the average size in a place like Mississippi or Alabama, where you had the cotton economy and the slave holdings were much larger. So.
Thank you. William wanted to find out, did the legendary status of the Confederate Orphan Brigade and John Breckinridge help to enhance the lost cause in Kentucky?
Yes, that was definitely the Orphan Brigade, which was so called. Historians sort of have a couple of theories on how the Orphan Brigade got its name, but sort of the most widely held idea is that it was this brigade of Confederate soldiers who was basically exiled from its state, their state, for the most of the war, and were so sort of orphaned in that exile. And so they were very prominent within this lost cause movement. Very well represented. They had reunions well into the 20th century that were covered in newspapers and in Confederate periodicals that were, sort of regionally read. So that was definitely the mythology of the Orphan Brigade was a big part of the Lost Cause movement in Kentucky.
Now, was John Breckinridge, did he command that brigade? I'm not as familiar.
I don't know. I bet somebody on here knows.
Okay. If you do know, you can pop that into the chat for us. KCU History Department is with us today. Thank you guys for being here. And one of our students would like to know why women were commonly Confederate sympathizers in this era.
Yeah, so it's interesting. They weren't really any more likely to be Confederate sympathizers than than men. But a woman's sort of, as a group, their sort of role in society in the late 19th century, sort of the sort of maternalist role that they had within the family extended into the public sphere. And they were known as sort of, historians put it, keepers of the past. So this is kind of the age before the mass professionalization of history, where, you know, instead of having people like me, university professors, come talk about history, you would just have civically minded everyday citizens come and talk about history and attest to history. And so it was seen as sort of an extension of their role as, you know, it's sort of a feminine thing to do, to be in charge of history. And they were extremely well organized within first these monument societies that sprung up after the war, and then which later were folded into the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And so they just did history very effectively. And it was sort of seen as their societal role.
Interesting. So Deborah Thompson was commenting that I think some of their efforts to change that narrative, the UDC's efforts, she said, "Oh man, some of this sounds so contemporary." And she also would like to know regarding the picture of the African-American miners in Jenkins, what day of the year is Emancipation Day that they were celebrating in Jenkins?
It's August, typically. I want to say August 7th, maybe, is the traditional day that it was celebrated.
Okay.
I might be off there, though, but it's an August date.
She also asked if any other states passed laws like the Uncle Tom's Cabin statute.
Not that I'm aware of, actually. That was highly sort of, I mean, that was sort of the Kentucky UDC going above and beyond. And I think it's a really interesting example of women who, if we recall, didn't even have the power to vote at that time, really going into, you know, we sort of think of women as being outside of official politics during this time period because they couldn't vote. They couldn't be, elected officials, but they really pressured, they went straight to their elected officials. I mean, using telephone calls and going to the offices of their elected assemblymen and really pressured them. So, yeah, and it's interesting. I think I saw another question on there about that Uncle Tom's Cabin law. So that was used, actually, African American in several places in Kentucky tried to use that law because it said, they claimed that there were other forms of media, including, for example, the play The Klansman, which was later the basis for the movie Birth of a Nation. So in both instances, The Klansman, which was a play, and The Birth of a Nation, African American communities in several places in Kentucky basically enlisted the law to try to get those productions, basically keep them from being shown. And they had some luck in Louisville. But the white Kentuckians also enlisted the Uncle Tom's Cabin statue to prevent the showing of the footage of the Jim Johnson the Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries boxing match, in which Jack Johnson, African-American boxer, heartily beats Jim Jeffries, the Great White Hope. So they viewed this as racially incendiary, right? That this might cause African-American audiences to rise up and protest. And so in Lexington, they used the law to prevent that boxing match from being shown.
Interesting. To follow up on that, the KCU History Department wanted to know if that statute, the Uncle Tom's Cabin statute, was ever legally challenged.
Yes, well, it wasn't legally challenged as a piece of law, but it was used, as I mentioned, to try to prevent what African Americans saw as racially incendiary. movies like Birth of a Nation from being shown. So, but I haven't seen any actual legal challenge to that.
Okay. Joetta she wanted to know, I believe it's the Confederate statue that was at U of L in Louisville, and it was moved to Brandenburg, Kentucky. She wanted to know why it was moved there.
So it's because, this is a great question. It's because the mayor of Brandenburg and several other local officials there actually courted the monument. They asked to be given the monument. They have a sort of area on they're along the banks of the Ohio River there, and they have every other year they have a stage a reenactment of John Hunt Morgan's cavalry raid over the river to into Indiana. And so they kind of have a sort of Civil War tourism effort going there, and they thought that this monument would enhance the their tourism, but it's really kind of, I think, a controversial thing that the city of Louisville did in moving that monument, because essentially what they did was they moved it to a place where it was celebrated. It was recommissioned, basically commemorated, and there was a crowd of hundreds of people, including a Confederate color guard, and they sang. It was much like had a lot of shades of the original 1895 commemorative ceremony in Louisville. And so I think that really raises a question of what responsibility communities have when they decide that they're going to divest themselves of these monuments. What kind of due diligence do they need to do in thinking about how it's going to be interpreted once it's moved?
So let's see. Oh, and Chuck and Bill have confirmed that Breckinridge was indeed the first commander of the Orphan Brigade. Thank you, guys. Fred Cowan also has a question, which I'll read. Let's see. He would like to know, what explains the fact that the transformation to pro-Confederacy seems to be so sudden? Just the Emancipation Proclamation, which didn't apply to Kentucky, of course. Large parts of Southern Kentucky remained loyal to the Republican Party. Why were their voices drowned out in the state as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the turn was sort of, I won't say sudden, but as I was researching, what I found was there was a lot of dismay. So yes, Kentucky was exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, but white Kentuckians had a pretty keen understanding that emancipation anywhere, right, weakened the institution of slavery everywhere. And so they were pretty upset about this. When I really saw this uptick of anger and anti-federal sentiment during the Civil War in Kentucky was when the federal government began enlisting African-American men into the Union Army. And so this really angered Kentuckians, both because they felt like, one, having African-American men fight for the Union cause degraded the Army as a whole. And they also were upset because this was a way that the federal government essentially gave, and I don't want to say gave, these men earned their freedom. These African-American men earned their freedom by fighting in the Union Army. There were about 25,000 African-American men from Kentucky, which is the second largest number of any state, from any state, who did earn their freedom and the freedom of their some of their family members and children as well through their service to the Union. So this basically negated slavery, right? This allowed these people to legally become free before Kentucky was subject to the 13th Amendment. So you saw a lot, I mean, in soldiers' letters, they're very angry about African Americans in the Army. Civilians who are in areas where African American men are on, you know, garrison duty are very upset about seeing African American men in Union uniforms carrying guns, right? It's a huge upheaval of the social order. So that's really where you see it. And yes, to the question about republicanism, these are linked, because what happens is there are vestiges of, you have Union veterans. For example, Thomas Speed would be, who's a Louisville citizen, was very active as a Union veteran, and tried to write, he wrote a big book called The Union Cause in Kentucky. And what becomes clear in these celebrations of white unionism is that it's really hard for them to get away from this legacy, both of African American enlistment and the fact that the war became a war of emancipation. In other words, many of these Union veterans are not any less racist than the Confederate veterans and Confederate sympathizers, right? And this was not what they intended the war to do. So because because African Americans were pretty effective at using Unionist memory to attain rights, right? To argue for the right to vote, to argue for the right to serve on juries. That also, it's hard for them to sort of claim, white Union veterans, conservative white Union veterans, to claim, some sort of Union, Union service and honor that isn't somehow compromised by these other connotations.
Thank you. Mary also wanted to know, how did Reconstruction efforts in the Confederacy influence the Kentucky view of the war after the fact?
That's a great question too. So so Kentucky was largely exempt from Reconstruction measures because it had been a loyal state, except for the fact that because there was so much recalcitrance on the part of whites to adjusting to the new order of things after the war, the federal government did establish the Freedmen's Bureau in Kentucky. But they did, like, by and large, a lot of white Kentuckians sort of took up what they saw was the cause of these, poor, benighted Confederate states to the South that had, they saw as being overrun by federal interference. And so I think I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that the Kentuckians cheered in 1877 in the streets when the federal troops were removed from the South, because they saw themselves as having common cause with these states to the South that had, they felt had been unfairly oppressed by the federal government and its civil rights measures.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh, Trish commented, she says, last month's presentation, and I'm guessing you mean Adam Dombey's presentation at the Filson, about the lost cause as well. Last month's presentation had an interesting report that the so-called veterans were often not veterans. That's how popular being a Confederate soldier had become. That's very interesting.
There was a whole phenomenon of, especially you could really see this in places like Louisville, which grew into this, sort of manufacturing hub after the Civil War. And they produced all of these goods, and they would send these salesmen out. They were called drummers, and they would all sort of take names like colonel, major, captain, as they went around and sold goods door to door. But that was the idea, was, being a Confederate veteran, whether you had really been one or not, taking on that mantle was definitely a good way to sell goods. So
they did what they thought was going to make it easiest. So Jessica Stavros is confirming for us that August 8th is Emancipation Day. So we were close there. There's been several comments kind of lamenting the role of white Kentucky women in the United Daughters of the Confederacy, wishing that they would have turned their efforts to something perhaps more positive for the state. Jeff Rogers would like to know, were there voices or organizations challenging the United Daughters of the Confederacy?
Yeah, I mean, there were certainly the counterparts to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. For example, the women who were involved with the women's auxiliary to the Grand Army, they did a lot of, trying to tell the Union narrative. But they also had issues because they, in the late 19th century, decided that they needed to, have segregated chapters of the Women's Relief Corps. Again, these issues of, African American memory and white memory, even not just in Kentucky but nationally, sometimes didn't, they were in tension with one another. But really, I mean, I think that it's just a testament to the strength of the UDC that they really rewrote history, and they came in with this kind of moral authority, because these were the elite women of the community. Being involved in the UDC was a mark of status, not just derived from your connections to the war, but to your current status in society. And they just wielded a lot of public authority. So there were challenges in some places, but they overall, in many, many Southern communities, were a very powerful cultural force.
I've heard a number of people talk about how their textbook campaign and how they were, when they learned history at school when they were young, it was a very, very pro-Southern view, because the United Daughters of the Confederacy paid for textbooks that said that. So Joetta commented that there was lots of violence during Reconstruction that was specifically aimed at African American Union veterans. Mm-hmm. And let's see. Oh, Deborah would like to know, did the Order of Kentucky Colonels evolve from that view of veterans, or where did that come from?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So the Kentucky Colonels were founded in early 1830s by a Kentucky governor named Ruby Laffoon, which has to be up there with the great names of politicians of all time. But yeah, he started this order, and it really wasn't connected to it's really just as it is today, a sort of honorary sort of title that's bestowed on people for their service to the Commonwealth. And it was kind of it was an honor, but it was also a bit of a marketing tool as well. So it really didn't have any official connection to people's military service, but it sort of picked up on this colonel character that had been alive and well in Kentucky since the end of the Civil War.
Well, guys, that is all of the questions that I see in the chat feature. Are there any others that you guys would like to add? Let's see. I see Mary and Carl. I'm trying to unmute you here.
Okay. Yes. I'm Carl Kramer, retired from Indiana University Southeast. I reviewed Creating a Confederate Kentucky in Journal of American History back in 2011. And I recall just glancing through again this morning, realizing once I got into it, I'm thinking as far as the lost cause narrative in Kentucky being so obvious in terms of protecting and defending slavery. And I'm thinking, do you have some explanation of why historians hadn't picked up on this before you did? Because I would have been among those groups that missed it too, and it just seemed like, of course, once I got into it.
Well, thank you so much for that very generous review before I try to answer your question. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I don't know why people hadn't picked up on the connection, because certainly historians looking at the lost cause in other places had picked up on that connection with slavery before. So yeah, I don't know why that was that but you know, once I started looking at these letters from Union soldiers and people after the war, it was very, very clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing we also oftentimes forget, is that these people who in the past, you know, I think there has been the effort to separate monuments and other symbols of the lost cause from issues of slavery and efforts to retain white supremacy after the war. But we forget that those people didn't. They connected them for us, and they didn't see anything wrong with it. You know, views have changed over time, clearly. And so, you know, now we understand that, you know, those views were you know, harmful, not right, but they, you know, but those people in the past did not feel that way. So
I have a follow-up because later this fall, I have another review coming out in Journal of American History on Christopher C. Moore's new book, Apostle of the Lost Cause. I don't know if you're familiar with that yet or not, but it's about J. William Jones, Baptist, and the development of Confederate memory. And he was a minister himself and was very much involved in spreading the lost cause gospel. And I wondered if in this studying Kentucky, you have looked at since then any influence in among religious leaders, denominational leaders, chaplains in spreading the lost cause gospel in Kentucky.
There's a great book that is on that very subject by Luke Harlow, who is a historian at the University of Tennessee. So
maybe the same series.
He's done that. So I would highly recommend that for anyone who's interested. I didn't really focus much on, I focused a lot on politics and culture, and not very much on religion, but it was definitely there. So.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Thank you.
I just recently heard about that book myself, so I'm glad you brought that up, Carl. Let's see here. I've had a couple more things submitted through the chat feature. Let's see. Stuart Sanders wants me to say thank you for joining us today, Anne. Joetta commented that when she moved to Atlanta in 1997, a variation of the lost cause narrative was still being promulgated by the respected Atlanta History Center. It's something white people didn't want to let go of even now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree with that based on experiences with visitors. Let's see. Oh, and thank you, Stuart. He's got the Luke Harlow, the author that you just mentioned. He's typed that into the chat for us. Okay. And all right. Any other questions that we can ask Dr. Marshall before we let you all? Oh, I see another one. Okay. Stephen Brown says, Reverend Stuart Robinson here in Louisville would be a prime example of Carl's suggestion. So Reverend Stuart.
Thanks, Stephen.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, he appears, Stuart Robinson appears, who was a Presbyterian minister.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he was very involved in lots of commemorative activities after the war.
And Deborah was bringing up, and Deborah works with KHS, I'll say that, that the United Daughters of the Confederacy even actually did play a role, and the lost cause narrative played a role in the establishment of the Kentucky Historical Society. And I don't think we're alone in that among Southern historical societies, but that is something that, you know, certainly as an institution that we have to grapple with, and have a very, very large collection of Confederate relics, which all used to be on display in the old state capitol, from what I'm told. It's been a long time ago, but they had a whole room. So that's it's part of our history as well, even here. So. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming today. Enjoyed having you here. I see somebody else. Oh, thank you, Jody. Next month, on first Friday in October, as we look toward the election, we are going to be hearing from professor at Eastern Kentucky University about the history of the Electoral College. And I think that's going to be great. So please join us, get registered for that. You can sign up on our website. Thank you all very much. And I hope to see you again next month. Alan Lytle, I know you're here. Hang out for just a few minutes so that you can talk to Dr. Marshall. All right, I'll see everybody next month.
Thanks very much.